Thank you very much. I feel proud to be the moderator of this session. I hope the first session will provide you a lot of background on the RCEP agreement as well, and including key feature and perhaps the advantage of the whole book. But book is the book. If you don't read, it would be no benefit at all. So please read the book. But I feel that it would be a lot of questions for session 2. Session 2, we are focusing on the impact, and impact in general and also impact in particular. The impact of RCEP on East Asia is one of the things that everyone want to talk to, and also everyone want to discuss. And also we feel that it is a need also to discuss the impact on the particular interests of Cambodia, but perhaps we come from the bigger picture first, and we can narrow down to the smaller picture. The session today, we are fortunate to have three particular speakers. First, I would like to introduce Professor Ken Itakura, that is the current professor of the Graduate School of Economics, Nagoya University. Professor Itakura is a leading researcher on trade and regional integration, trade and integration modeling, such as global computational general equilibrium, that we call CGE, and GTAP model, and trade policy modeling. He has extensively published in leading economic journals. So this is the first speaker. The second speaker is Professor Ken. Professor Ken Itakura will be presenting on the impact of RCEP, a global computation general equilibrium simulation, the CGE simulation. Second speaker, we have Professor Inun Pak. Professor Inun Pak is a professor from Graduate School of International Study, Korean University. He is currently the director of the Center for East Asia Institute for Global Research Institute in Korean University. Professor Park is a leading author in regional integration policy modeling of FTA and Korean economy. He has published several books and papers on regional integration and in leading economic journal. Professor Park will discuss the topic on the comparison of RCEP and other free trade agreements. We also have another speaker, Mr. Hing Vutta, is a Cambodian scholar. He will be talking in conjunction with the other Cambodian official. Mr. Hing Vutta is the PhD of economy, and he's from the University of Adelaide. So without further ado, I think I would like to invite Professor Itakura first. I hope Professor would give us a very precise and what we call the insights that we take as a benefit from this book. So please, Professor Itakura, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction. So let me share my screen. And okay, I hope everyone can see this slide. Okay, so
I hope you can speak a little bit loudly. So,
oh yes,
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry for this.
Sorry. So thank you so much for the introductions, and also it's great honor to share these studies findings with His Excellencies, ambassadors, and also distinguished guests today. I'm Ken Itakura from Nagoya City University. Today I will present impact of RCEP, a global computable general equilibrium CGE simulation result. Aim of this study is to estimate the economic effect of RCEP. For this purpose, we use a dynamic computable general equilibrium model of global trade, which incorporates the structure of global supply chains, or also known as global value chain. So we incorporating this GSC or GBC to highlight the importance of trade in intermediate goods and services. Okay, our study began with constructing baseline scenario for 2014 to 2035. So baseline scenario is a future state of the global economy without RCEP. So once we establish the baseline scenario, we are able to implement 4 different RCEP scenarios. RCEP scenario includes liberalization of trade in goods and services, as well as investment commitment under RCEP. So let me explain a little bit about the baseline scenario first. Okay, we constructed a baseline for 2014 to 2035, which depends on many database and projections. Our key database is coming from GTAP database version 10, which covers 141 countries and regions, and also 65 industrial sectors, which representing 2014's world economies. So to reduce the computational burden, I aggregated to the 25 regions and 24 sectors to cover the all RCEP member countries and also important industrial sectors. To highlight the global supply chain, I use inter-country input-output table, which is published by OECD November last year. For the macroeconomic projections, I rely on the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook, which was published October 2021. To describing long-term projection on demographic change, I use World Population Prospect from United Nations. For the bilateral import tariffs on goods, I use a database available from Market Access Map, which called MarkMap, published last year, updated last year as well. Okay, all these databases are combined, and I extended dynamic GTAP model to incorporating global supply chain or global value chain structure in it. So just briefly look at the baseline projections. Well, this is a demographic change captured by working age population ratio, which is defined as age 15 to 64 years population divided by total populations. So this graph shows for ASEAN member states. So you notice all of the ASEAN member states shares similar patterns. Okay, working age population ratio start increasing after the 1960s and it peaked around the 2010 or 2020. After the peak, that working age population ratio declines in the future. Okay, for the Cambodian's case, the peak will be coming a little bit later than other ASEAN countries, but a declining trend will be shared. Okay, for the other RCEP countries, for example, Japan, the peak of working age populations already happened around the 1990, a little bit later than 1990s, but since then, declining trend continues for that countries. Even for China, working age population ratio start declining in the middle of 2010. Declining trend continues for other RCEP countries as well. Turning to the macroeconomic projections, okay, I use the World Economic Outlook from IMF October issues last year. This is the annual growth rate of real GDP for world as a whole, and also RCEP, and also ASEAN as a whole. So as you can see, since 2019, 2020 are pretty much negatively affected by COVID-19 pandemic. But since then, recovery from that 2020 is remarkable. And then we are expecting to ASEAN's annual growth rate will be substantially higher than RCEP and also world average. So this is the underlying macro projections, okay? So now we are turning into the projections for world trade volumes, okay? World trade volume continues to grow 2014 to 2035, a little bit declining trend observed around the 2020. But after that, we are expected to world trade volume to be grow. But most of the world trade volume would be accounted by intermediate goods and services trade, so which amounts to about 70% of world trade. Okay, among this intermediate trade, okay, I computed a share of RCEP and also ASEAN's share in intermediate trade volumes. Okay, upper panel shows ASEAN's for baseline, exports, and also imports of intermediate goods and services continue to grow. So that's expected in a baseline scenario, okay, which amounts around 70%, okay, to a little bit more than 9%. RCEP as a whole, they explained lots of global supply chain, accounted for more than 30% for exporting and also importing in a baseline. Okay, once we set up the baseline scenario, well, we can move on to RCEP scenarios. So in this study, we prepared 4 different RCEP scenarios, starting with scenario number 1, which include only import tariff reductions. Okay, this import tariff reductions data is coming from RCEP's actual agreements Annex 1 schedule of tariff commitment. Okay, second scenario, add reduction of services trade ad valorem equivalent on top of scenario number 1. So we are expecting RCEP to be lower than ad valorem equivalents of non-tariff measures on services trade. Okay, 20% reduction over 10 years. Okay, the estimates of ABE is coming from empirical studies in the past. Okay, third scenario, further including logistic improvements on top of scenario 2. Okay, because RCEP will bring into the more smoother and efficient custom clearance, okay, which will reduce time cost of merchandise trade. So which is expected 20% reduction in logistic improvements over 10 years. So key parameters and data are estimated by Hammers and Minot. And so I use World Bank's doing business data for days associated with importing and also exporting. The last scenario, scenario number 4, further adding investment commitment over the scenario 3. Because rate of return to investment in the model differs across countries, which reflects country-specific risk. Okay, because of RCEP investment commitment, reducing the country risk or country-specific differentials in rate of returns. Okay, lowering these risks or country differentials will increase inward foreign direct investment into the member countries that year of RCEP, following the year of RCEP. So empirical estimates, we are using is 19.6% higher. Inward FDI flow is expected. So, but basically idea here is, well, setting up the baseline and then running an RCEP simulation and then measuring the difference between baseline and also RCEP scenario, which can be the measure for the difference between the baseline and also RCEP. Thus, there's a measurement for the impact of RCEP. Okay, before going to the RCEP simulation result, I just highlighted that import tariff reduction schedule. For example, Cambodia, okay, they started relatively higher rate of bilateral aggregated import tariff, but over the years, well, their commitment in liberalization is quicker and deeper in a sense, as compared to the other countries as well. Okay, and for the other RCEP countries, they are starting from the little bit lower import tariff rate, but they committed to lower that import tariffs for China, Korea, New Zealand, Australia, Japan as well. Okay. So now we are trying to look into the RCEP simulation result. Okay. So this is the impact on annual growth rate of real GDP for ASEAN as a whole. Okay. Light gray color bar stands for the baseline scenarios, annual growth rate of real GDP. Okay. Scenario 4, including tariff reduction, services average ad valorem equivalent reductions, logistics improvements, and the investment commitments. That's the scenario 4. Okay. RCEP will increase that annual growth rate of real GDP for the first year of implementation. 0.09% percentage point will be increased in annual growth rate. Following the year, well, since inward foreign direct investment starts coming in, 0.32 percentage point higher growth rate will be resulted thanks to RCEP implementation. Okay. Over the year, the effect of RCEP is substantial, but over the time, the effect will be tapers off. Okay. So this annual growth rate will be turned into the level of real GDP. Okay. This is a picture showing that difference between baseline level of real GDP and also RCEP simulation scenarios level of real GDP. For example, simulation scenario number 1, tariff reduction only scenario, RCEP will bring in 0.19% higher real GDP as compared to the baseline scenario. Okay, once RCEP start expanding liberalization component to the services trade liberalization and also logistics improvement, which contribute to a 1.32% higher real GDP. And once we allow for that investment commitment to contribute more to that effect. So in a 2035, 2.5% higher real GDP than baseline scenario. Okay, so at the end of 2035, putting into the table, we can observe here, ASEAN as a whole, under the scenario 4, 2.5% higher real GDP than baseline scenario, which can be converted into the absolute term measured in US billions. Okay, for the case of scenario 4, ASEAN's real GDP will be higher than baseline by 160 billion US dollars. For the RCEP as a whole, reflecting the big, larger size of economies such as Japan, China, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, okay, absolute gains in real GDP will be larger, amount to 675 US billion. Okay, so in a chapters, I reported individual countries number as well. So if you're interested, please take a look at that chapter. But for the Cambodia's case, individual countries' real GDP impact is displayed, illustrated as here. Okay, tariff reductions, service trade liberalizations, and so improvements in logistics, and so investment commitments contribute to our Cambodia's real GDP is now higher than 6% than baseline. So our RCEP impact is 6% in real GDP term. Okay, now turn into the economic welfare, which is a measurement for the representative household well-beings. ASEAN as a whole, 1.1% higher economic welfare gains in terms of US billion, 44 billion US dollar terms. That's a result in our economic welfare. If we look into the intermediate trade volumes, which is important for the global supply chains and also participation into the global value chains, okay, upper panel showing ASEAN's exports volume, also ASEAN's import volumes, comparing to the baseline case and also scenario 4's case, both cases showing that because of RCEP, their inclusion or participation in global supply chains and global value chains increased, okay, even for the RCEP as well. Their share in the world trade volume of intermediates increased. Okay, these are the simulation results. Let me just quickly highlight this study attempts. We try to evaluate the impact of RCEP using global CG model, incorporating global supply chain structures, and then using tariff reduction schedule for RCEP countries. And also we are using existing FTAs tariff reduction schedule as well. Okay. This simulation includes services trade liberalization, logistic improvements, and investment commitment. And we show that impact of RCEP on macro indicators such as real GDP and economic welfare, and also world trade volumes in intermediate goods and services. Okay. In our future studies, we keep updating, improving key data inputs, and also we need to polish further the model and simulation settings. We hope that by doing so, we should be able to address limitations and caveats in the methodology used in these studies in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. And then just selected references are listed in the presentation files, which I will send it to later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Itakura. I think you cover a lot of insights and give us a very good picture of the modeling. I feel that it is too technical for the immediate understanding of the model, but at least we feel that you highlight points of interest that we can capture. For example, the tariff reduction that would lead to the annual growth rates of each country, and the reduction of service trade, and those would also contribute a lot to the wealth of the country as a member. And you also capture and give us the clear picture of the logistics improvement, and also the impacts, the investment commitment that would reduce the risk, and give us the impacts of the trade volume, real GDP, and the increase of the investment in the member state. We do have a question for you, sir, but I would keep the question at the end of the session. I feel that the audience here physically also have questions. The people from outside who got online also have questions. But for sure, we will read your book on the chapter on the impact, and then we will come back to you, either contact you online or doing some correct or direct communication through the email, etc. But for all in all, the modeling showing the positive impact, giving us a lot of hope and interest, and we feel that the book did provide the pathway, and we feel that RCEP will do more good than bad. So without further ado, Professor, please stay first. We will have a question for you. This is a very professional and very technical session. I would like to invite another presenter that would give us another very relevant perspective that would also be the interest of the audience. I would like to invite Professor from the Korean University, Professor Inun Pak. So Professor Inun Pak would also talking about the impact, but he do it in comparison with the other free trade agreement. So without further ado, I invite Professor Park. I already introduced Professor Park. I hope you would give us also a clear picture on the comparative way between this RCEP and other free trade agreements. Please, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning. I'm Inun Pak at Korea University. Let me start my presentation by sharing my presentation file. So I'm sure you can clearly see this slide. So actually, this chapter, I evaluated the desirability of the RCEP by comparing it with other related multilateral RTAs, such as the CPTPP and even the FTAs. So to compare those effects, I try to answer the following questions. For East Asia and the ASEAN, why do we need to have the RCEP? Elaborating the necessity of the RCEP. And secondly, by using some qualitative analysis, I try to answer the following question. Is the RCEP a desirable RTA to take? And then what makes that RCEP desirable? And then lastly, I simply surveyed some quantitative analysis to find whether the gains we can achieve from the RCEP is big enough, and how we distribute those gains among the members. Okay, so that is research questions I conducted. So this slide simply elaborating the logic, the structure of the paper. Since the East Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, we observed the proliferating formation of regional trade agreement as reported in Table 1, and then deepening regional interdependence, mainly through market-driven trade and investment activities under the deeply interconnected regional value chains in East Asia compared to other regions as reported in Table 2. These proliferating and competitive bilateral and plurilateral RTAs resulted in a complicated web of overlapping RTAs mapped in this Table 3. As you can see from this Table 3, most of the country pairs have been already interconnected by forming either bilateral or plurilateral RTAs. In particular, all the ASEAN members boxed in this green-colored pair relationship have been already connected, except two cases, China, Japan, and Japan, Korea here, right? So that is, this table simply elaborate very complicated web of overlapping RTAs in this East Asian region. And then these complicated web of overlapping East Asian RTAs simply resulted in kind of very complicated and restrictive rules of origin, okay, as investigated in the following studies. Actually, those restrictive and complicated rules of origin simply incurred lower FTA utilization rate, even though we allocated too much resources to make them effective. But actually the funds and then companies utilize this opportunity very rarely, mostly lower than 50%. So based on Fukunaga's study and Hayakawa's study, we found that those complicated rules of origin, particularly in the 5 ASEAN +1 FTAs, simply resulted in the lower utilization rate RTAs, because those studies simply indicate some of the developing members of the ASEAN +1 FTAs prefer to use other alternative ways of liberalizing, utilizing their trade activities, such as duty drawback, bilateral FTAs, and then ITA and the GSP methodologies, rather than utilizing the complicated ASEAN +1 FTAs. Accordingly, so all those existing studies about measuring the FTA utilization rate, particularly focusing on those East Asian FTAs, commonly indicated mostly lower than 50% FTA utilization rate, making those East Asian FTAs less effective. Accordingly, these the figure 1A and figure 2B, those two figures, we found that all of the countries in the region show increasing intra-regional trade share, but mainly driven by trade with China rather than trade with ASEAN. Those observations, as you can see from this each different ASEAN +1 FTA case, there is a trend of intra-regional trade value from year 2000 until year 2020. Then there is increasing trend mostly, but driven by trade relations with China rather than the ASEAN countries. So accordingly, we can simply summarize our findings as follows. We found that all of the countries in the region show increasing inter-regional trade share, of course. So it is a little bit, it may indirectly support there is more deepening, much deepening inter-regional trade activities, but it may not have, we may not find, we didn't find any clear evidence it caused by those 5 ASEAN +1 FTAs. These observations partially support the existing findings from existing rigorous empirical studies by using the gravity regression analysis in the Yang and Martinez et al. And Okabe and Inun Pak. So partly supporting a little bit successful trade creation effect of ASEAN-China FTA and ASEAN-Korea FTA, and the mostly insignificant trade creation effect found from ASEAN-New Zealand FTA and ASEAN-India CECA and ASEAN-Japan CEP. So in sum, we can say there is no clear evidence of trade creation and diversion caused by the 5 ASEAN +1 FTAs as a possible turning point identified by the ERIA effect, as I identify here in this. If there exists some positive trade creation effect because of these implementation of ASEAN +1 FTAs as a turning point in these years, we may find some distinctive change of trade pattern, but we couldn't find that the distinct effect coming from this table. Okay, so these, as I mentioned earlier, we found that those lower FTA utilization rate in these existing ASEAN +1 FTAs simply explain why those FTAs have not been very effective. So to make it effective, to overcome those shortcomings, we should have some a little bit better trade bloc activities, including the RCEP, RCEP implementation. So first, until now, I simply explained why we changed from those competitive and complicated ASEAN +1 FTAs to the megalateral RCEP approach by consolidating and all those existing RTAs. So that's the starting point. Then, even though we found that there is a necessity of making a bigger and more upgraded regional trade agreement among the members in this East Asia and the ASEAN countries, it doesn't mean that RCEP is a desirable and also a more desirable RTA compared to the other megalateral RTAs, such as the CPTPP. So I tried to answer those questions. The first, I used qualitative evaluation of the possible gains coming from the RCEP and other FTAs by investigating some member-specific scale effect. So as reported in Table 5 to Table 8, I investigated some scale factors determining the size effect of the RCEP on the trade creation and trade diversion. Okay? So that includes the market size and the development gap and the participation in supply chains for measuring interdependence, and also intra-regional trade agreement trade volume, intra-regional trade agreement trade intensity, and complementarity and concentration of trade product, trade cost, and cultural affinity compared to other FTAs. But as you can see from this slide, the black-colored determinant contributed positively to those gains from the RCEP greater than the other FTAs. And then the red-colored the determinant may be some considerable determinant limiting the positive gains coming from the RCEP relative to the other RTAs. But overall, we may say that these option of taking the megalateral trade bloc like the RCEP can be a desirable policy option for those East Asian ASEAN countries to take, and then it can be a more desirable compared to the other RTAs as an alternative, right? So this is simply the based on the size of that trade bloc. And secondly, I did some evaluation based on what's that, the effect coming from the depths of those considered interdependent RTAs, RCEP, CPTPP, and the USMCA, many other alternative megalateral RTAs. As reported in tables 9 and 10, when you evaluate the depths of the RCEP in terms of provisions considered, including the tariff concession rate compared to the other RTAs, consolidating and upgrading the 5 ASEAN +1 FTAs, the depths of the RCEP simply deepened. Okay? So that may positively contribute to the absolute value of likely impact coming from the implementation of the RCEP. Okay? But when you compare some coverage and the rigorousness of those provisions, including tariff concession rate of the RCEP to competitive CPTPP and USMCA, we found that it is desirable, but it is quite questionable whether the RCEP is more desirable than other competitive interdependent megalateral RTAs such as CPTPP and USMCA. So it is desirable, but whether it is more desirable, I cannot answer. But we may simply expect those gains coming from the depths and then tariff concession rate could be a little bit weaker than the other related megalateral RTAs. Additionally, we have to consider the sequence of those implementation of the RCEP after the CPTPP. That means the arrival of the RCEP after the CPTPP could limit the additional gains to the RCEP members, especially for dual members. So they may prefer to utilize the CPTPP, just stay there. They do not switch to the RCEP provisions. Okay, so that may even contribute to the some less effective the RCEP effect we may realize. Okay? But anyway, those qualitative analysis simply limited our evaluation by using some limited statistical data rather than comprehensively covering all the necessary economy indicators get together. Okay, so that's the limitation. So I move to next step to answer the same question, whether the RCEP is desirable and more desirable by applying the quantitative CG model analysis, okay, to evaluate the expected gains from the RCEP and other FTAs. Okay? So that is reported in the tables 11 and 12 and summarized in figure 3. Actually, I selected the following 4 CG model analysis. The first one is Ferrantino et al., and second Chong et al., third Patrick and Plummer, and then lastly the Park et al.'s paper. I selected those CG model analysis. I have to mention mention this one first. Actually, right before this presentation, Professor Itakura already presented more specific and more detailed information about the likely impact coming from the RCEP. Okay, so that's why I didn't include this one. Also, recently, Estrades et al. At the World Bank released their recent, the most updated CG model analysis focusing on the RCEP effect. So those 2 papers are very informative, the papers about the likely impact investigated, but those 2 papers are not very related to my own design to compare the likely impact. So I selected 4 papers. Why? Because as you can see from this slide, I simply identified the difference. So make it simple. This paper, Ferrantino et al., I select this one as some traditional CG model analysis, very typical empirical study. Ex ante simulation analysis has been done to expect likely impact, just comparing the effect coming from the RCEP versus effect coming from the CPTPP without considering any sequential implementation or any specific things, just tariff, non-tariff, and service sectors liberalization package has been included by using the very well-known World Bank linkage model. And then Chong's paper, okay, this second paper is talking about by using the very traditional GTM model, but in advance to go for the CG model analysis, these paper simply estimate the likely impact of rule accumulation scheme on trade cost as a whole. So it's been included. Actually, the RCEP, one of the most distinct features coming from the RCEP is applying regional and diagonal rules of origin accumulation scheme. So that's why I selected. And next, as you know, these RCEP simplify on top of the CPTPP. So sequential implementation matters a lot. So I selected Patrick and Plummer's paper, okay, to find incremental effect. And then, of course, the current external economic condition affect a lot to our economics, that the likely impact. So U.S.-China trade war should be considered. So I used the outcome coming expectation provided by Pak et al.'s paper. Okay, so those are the 4 papers I compared for the comparison. And then table 11 simply compares the impact of megaletral RTAs on real GDP by independently simulating the liberalization package of the RCEP and other RTAs reported by Ferrantino et al. And Chung et al. And I found that they found that the RCEP 16 members drew larger benefit than CPTPP members. And then we don't need too much worry about that the trade diversion effect, harmful effect against the non-members. And also the CPTPP is more desirable for ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand than for CJK, China, Japan, and Korea. And the RCEP 16 is more desirable for CJK than ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand when we ignore the possible impact coming from that the regional rule accumulation. But if we consider the rule accumulation, then the both CPTPP, RCEP 16 become more desirable for ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand. Their benefit will be mostly increased than the CJKs. Okay? And then at country level, RCEP 16 is more desirable for Brunei, Darussalam, Malaysia, the Philippines, CJK, and India, when we ignore the effect coming from that the reduction of trade cost caused by the rule accumulation scheme. And then when we consider that the rule accumulation scheme, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and Korea drew the relatively larger gains. That's what I found from the ex-ante analysis. And then when we move to the sequential approach by using the Petri et al.'s paper and Pak et al.'s paper, okay, then they found that the members' gain from the CPTPP are larger, and additional gains from the RCEP on top of the CPTPP are much smaller than the independent simulated model estimation by the other 2 papers. And also dual members gains are much larger than single members gain from joining in either the RCEP or RCEP 16 on top of the CPTPP. Those dual members of the RCEP and CPTPP are found to overcome negative GDP effect incurred by the U.S.-China trade war, but still single members experience negative GDP effect. It's been covered by the implementation of the RCEP and CPTPP. Overall, those additional gains generated by the RCEP on top of CPTPP are negative for all members of the RCEP. However, that additional gains generated by the RCEP on top of the CPTPP are positive for all members, exception of the China, okay, when we consider that U.S.-China trade war. Particularly, ASEAN members will take some advantage of the U.S.-China trade war by collecting more GDP and more additional gains from implementing the CPTPP and the RCEP on top of the CPTPP. So the biggest the beneficiary of that the megaletral RTAs by sequentially implemented under the condition of that U.S.-China trade war. These effects of the RCEP on ASEAN's gains are mainly distributed to Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, both from both the diverted trade from China, okay, caused by the trade war and the megaletral RTAs together. Okay, so these are some policy implications we can find from that CAG model analysis. But overall, considering the determinant of that the megaletral RTAs, I emphasized the size and interconnectivity. rule accumulation schemes, sequential implementation, external environment, such as the US-China trade war. Regardless of models and specifications we adopted, the CPTPP is more desirable for the ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand. Particularly, the RCEP is more desirable for CJK, particularly China and Korea, and the FTA is the most desirable for all. And then that regime-wide rule accumulation of the RCEP and the CPTPP remarkably increased the ASEAN gains, particularly CPTPP's full accumulation will generate more powerful positive impact. So another additional gains from the RCEP on top of CPTPP are incremental, as we found, but not very significant, especially for the ASEAN single members. Okay? However, they are still significant for CJK because the CJK simply interconnected through the RCEP as the first time. Okay? And then the RCEP also significantly offset the harmful effect incurred because of the US-China trade war. Okay? So considering the gains shared among the RCEP members, reforming RCEP provisions is recommended. So the first part of this chapter, we highlighted less effective ASEAN +1 FTAs. These evidence of the effectiveness of the ASEAN +1 FTAs clarifies the importance of raising FTA utilization rate. Particularly the ASEAN members of the RCEP should seriously consider the predicted incremental gains generated under the rule accumulation scheme. So these observations strongly support the ASEAN, particularly the ASEAN LDCs, to initiate RCEP's reform. These reform initiatives also strengthen the ASEAN centrality as a driver of this proliferating regional trade agreement in this region. For China, Japan, and Korea, a step toward upgrading the RCEP provisions comparable to those of the CPTPP is also required. So CJK may consider a trilateral China, Japan, Korea FTA as some complementary or alternative sub-regional RTAs to generate some significant additional gains and instigate the ASEAN to accelerate reformative actions. And then also to upgrade that liberalization packages of the RCEP, the effective operation of the proposed RCEP secretariat should be emphasized to lead the ASEAN and other partners toward accepting more desirable multilateral RTAs. Okay, let me stop here and thank you for listening to my presentation. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have heard Professor Inun Pak that try to provide us insights on the comparative analysis of the main agreement, the RCEP, the Comprehensive Partnership Agreement, and the other FTA. And the result of evaluation, both quantitative and qualitative, also show us desirable strength and comparison to the more desirable. But the most lesson learned that we could take from this is the regional interdependence that professors try to highlight, that using key factor of the rule of origin accumulation that is good for the what we call for the desirable gain than the other for the RCEP member. And we feel that the table and the reflection in table starting from table 8, 9, 10, 11, all this provides the clear evidence that being a member of the RCEP, we could stand for gain than the other member. But anyway, Professor also tried to highlight that the most important thing is the relationship between China, Japan, Korea, that also serve as the important point as a partner for ASEAN member, and ASEAN member would get to stand for gain from this, and then it is possible that we will do our action plan in accordance with the other, if there's a membership of the other bigger agreement, then we have to align ourselves with this. But the most important message is independent that would give us possible gain and desirable move, both quantitatively and qualitatively. So thank you very much, Professor. I think we also have a question for Professor, but for the sake of time, I thank you very much. We will give you a question later on. And I would proceed to Mr. Hingwatha, Dr. Hingwatha, the candidate doctorate from the University of Adelaide. And he's together would provide the insights of the potential impact of RCEP and structural transformation of Cambodia. But this afternoon, he will do this with the, he do the chapter with the official from the Ministry of Commerce, Mr. Kong Bun Rod, Mr. Tetsai Chan Lee, and most importantly, the Professor Sandre from the Sunway University and University of Adelaide. I think this afternoon, we also going to have a session on Cambodia. So I would not put too much pressure on Mr. Butha to make a more deliberation on this. But anyway, we invite him to give a brief insights on the structural impact, potential structural impact of the RCEP on the transformation of Cambodian, maybe structural transformation or whatever you may call. So please, Dr. Butha, I may call you doctor, but you will get PhD anyway.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Chair. I'm very honored to represent the Cambodian research team who do empirical analysis of potential impact of RCEP on Cambodian structural reform. And the team consists of Professor Sandre Tengavilu, myself, and 3 young officers from Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Economy and Finance, who are Mr. Ek Khai Kau, Bonwat Kong, and Saijan Lee. The purpose of the paper is to empirically assess the impact of RCEP on Cambodian economy in terms of trade, economy, and employment. We also trying to identify the key domestic challenges and what are the structural gaps and how would be the best policy option to really fully benefit from the RCEP. I think before we go to the key feature, it's important to highlight the Cambodian integration trajectories. We know that Cambodia is one of the least developed countries that have undertaken the market reform, the economic structure from plan to market economy. So at the end, at the early stage of reform, economic integration is one of the priorities in its economic development plan. And as a result, we can see some of the important milestones. In 1999, we joined ASEAN and economic, thereafter the ASEAN economic FTA. And then in 2004, we joined the global trade system with WTO. And then at a later stage, recently, Cambodia had concluded and signed the Cambodian-China FTA. We expect to create a stronger investment trade linkage between China's. And of course, in November 2020, we conclude RCEP, which includes among the existing ASEAN existing trade partner, Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. And in 2021, Cambodia concluded a free trade agreement with South Korea, which we hope to have the stronger investment and trade platform to strengthen trade and then global value chain activity with the Korean partner. We already know that the Cambodian high growth and sustained growth has been largely driven by the more open and outward-looking trade investment policies. And we also believe that the policy of open regionalism, which is currently adopted by the Cambodian government, will also provide more dynamic and framework for further structural reform in order to align the domestic resources for the more competitive activity in the regions. So these are the key contexts when it comes to the regional economic integration of Cambodia. There's a couple of structural reform in Cambodia, but I think it's worth to highlight. One of which is the high and sustained growth for the last 2 or 3 decades. Cambodia managed to maintain the annual growth around 8 to 7%, despite there's a little bit of disruption in the 2009 that caused by the global financial crisis, and sadly recently by the global pandemic. But put that aside, we managed to have a high growth. And that high growth has been transformed into very fundamental structural reform in the Cambodian economies. The agrarian agricultural sector has been declining, but we see the very rapid and then increase in manufacturing and services, with the key contribution to the Cambodian economy. The growth has largely driven partly by services and then by the manufacturing, especially the export oriented manufacturing. We can see the textile, wearing, apparel and footwear as the dominant manufacturing activity in Cambodia. But sadly, that the manufacturing sector has not been yet diversified enough. There is little progress in diversifying beyond textile and footwear industries. But lately, in the last 2 or 3 years, we can see there's an emerging industry that Cambodian is now increasing its participation in the electronic and transport equipment industries. So these are the important key and structural transformation we are heading. And since we are much integrated, and then the government is now keen to expand the feasibility of having other FTA with the other partner, be exploring the potential impacts of Cambodian have with the RCEP. So the way in which we try to quantify the impact is using the structural gravity modeling, which I won't go detail into technical, but I will highlight the key findings from that. First of all, the estimation from the gravity model give us the threshold of import, the impact of the RCEP on export, Cambodian export. We can see that RCEP might increase Cambodian export from 9% to 18%. It depends on different scenarios. And we also do the structural sectoral analysis with the RCEP with the gravity estimation. And what we found is that the RCEP have a greater impact on industries such as electrical machineries and transportation equipment. That clearly point out the importance of this mega FTA in fostering a Cambodian transformation, diversification of Cambodian export. And even more important is to accelerate the integration and intensity of Cambodian into the regional global value chains. This is one of the key findings that we get from our gravity estimation. The gravity model can also allow us to estimate the export potential. So what we found is that with the RCEP member, Cambodian has the potential to export 3 billion US dollar further from what it currently exporting. And among the RCEP member countries like China, Korea, and Japan offer their large opportunity for Cambodia to, and that again highlight the importance of the China, Korea, and Japan. They come together of this country into the RCEP framework.
Dr. Vutta, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm a little bit rude, but I'm sorry for that, because for the sake of time, and we still have time to discuss the Cambodian issue in this afternoon. What we just heard from you is the empirical evidence that the structural model of Cambodian economy have to change or have to transform. And we appreciate very much that in chapter 8, you do highlight the need to change the all the structural reform, including something that relate to global value chain, logistics, etc. Professor Sandria and you lead a very good result of finding, and you did place a positive impact of RCEP on Cambodian economy, and you did also highlight a lot of policy recommendation that would attract multinational activity, industry, and you also give us the insights of the strong build-up of semi and skilled labor force. You just highlight on the relationship between logistics and transportation. It is a lot to say, and it is a lot to hear from you. I would recommend that the participant read chapter 8, and Dr. Vutta would share the presentation. And we did have going to have a discussion on Cambodia in the afternoon session, and we invite Dr. Vutta to participate also. I'm sorry to cut you short here because we got another session to go, and I would like to inform the audience that the good story is yet to come. The good story in this afternoon would reflects Cambodian need. So normally a good story would come last. Then I invite you not to lose the participation. You have to participate to see the importance of the good story on Cambodian this afternoon. Dr. Vutta, I'm so sorry for that because we have to deliver the session to another session. And also for the question, I think we don't have time for question to Professor Itakura or Professor Inun Pak. We will post question online. I think Dr. Sandre will have us to post question online, and the answer would come from you. I just highlight that we have 3 questions from Professor Itakura, 3 questions from Professor Park, and 2 questions from Mr. Vutta. And I hope Dr. Sandre would give us the support to post this question online or directly to the 3 eminent speakers. So let me allow me to thank you very much, and allow me to stop the session from this point in order to allow the continued session. So please, the audience, join with me to congratulate the 3 speakers, and we would continue for another session and the afternoon discussion on Cambodia. Thank you very much, sir.